What if everything we thought we knew about Chaco Canyon was wrong? What if the truth wasn't just hidden, but deliberately kept from the public?
A New Mexico Pueblo is using DNA testing to prove its ties to Chaco Canyon.
For decades, experts have tried to explain why this massive ancient site was built, why it was suddenly abandoned, and why no one ever returned. But every theory so far, drought, deforestation, even social collapse, has left too many unanswered questions. Now, Graham Hancock believes he's found the real answer. And some say it's the reason access to certain parts of Chaco Canyon has been quietly restricted. Stay tuned as we dive into the details. If there's one historical site that can reduce experienced archaeologists to tears, it's Chaco Canyon.
There is an ancient Indian saying that something lives only as long as the last person who remembers it.
Even though it's now just ruins, Chaco Canyon remains just as striking and overwhelming as it once was. But at first glance, it also appears strange and confusing. To give you an idea, Chaco Canyon served as the economic, commercial, and cultural center of what is now the United States during the pre-Columbian period. You can still find elements of Chacoan influence in nearby ancient cities, especially noticeable in their architectural design. Chaco was home to multiple great houses, enormous palace-style buildings with hundreds of rooms. The biggest of them all, Pueblo Bonito, had close to 1,000 rooms. And this is where things start getting confusing. Given how large Chaco Canyon is, especially with all these massive buildings, you'd expect it to have been a crowded city. But archaeological research says otherwise. Current estimates suggest that only about 2,000 people live there in total, which raises the obvious question: where did the workforce come from to build a place of this size? And who exactly were they building it for, if there weren't enough people to live in it? The land Chaco Canyon sits on is another mystery. Put simply, it's a dry, harsh desert with no river, a tough climate, and barely any trees. In fact, the 250,000 trees used to build the great houses had to be carried in from far away, and they were brought in on foot. This brings us to an even bigger question. Why Chaco Canyon? Why would anyone choose to build such a grand settlement in a place that offered no natural advantages? And things only get more confusing. The Chacoans spent around 300 years building their capital. Then one day, without warning, they abandoned it and never created anything like it again. Why did that happen? Chaco Canyon was the center of one of the most advanced and well-developed civilizations in ancient North America. And it's easy to understand why people think so. Even from the remains, it's clear that Chaco Canyon was a major achievement in both architecture and engineering. But the real story goes deeper. Archaeological findings indicate that the Chacoans had a highly organized and complex society, one that we still struggle to fully understand. As we explore further, we'll look into many aspects of this culture, including its social systems, unusual governance, and even its darker spiritual practices. But for now, let's focus on the one part of Chaco Canyon that grabs everyone's attention first: the architecture. There are 15 great houses scattered throughout Chaco Canyon, but out of all of them, Pueblo Bonito stands out the most. Even by today's standards, this massive building is impressive. It covers 3 acres of land, and its walls are up to 3 feet thick. Experts believe it was between 4 and 5 stories tall and had over 800 rooms, possibly housing up to 1,000 people. That kind of planning was almost unheard of at the time. Most communities would gradually add levels to their buildings, but the Chacoans built these tall structures from the start. Another thing that made the great houses so special was their construction method. The masonry techniques used were completely new for that era, and nearby cities eventually copied them, showing just how much Chacoan culture influenced the broader region. These great houses didn't go up quickly either. Many of them took decades or even centuries to complete. Pueblo Bonito alone took roughly 300 years to finish. That timeline brings up another puzzle. The Chacoans didn't leave behind any written documents, There's no proof they even had a writing system. So how did the original builders manage to pass along the building plans for hundreds of years and still produce such precise and advanced structures? Take Pueblo Bonito as an example. It has a semicircular design, and its courtyard is split exactly down the middle by a true north-south axis. Other great houses like Una Vida, Chetroquetl, and Pueblo del Arroyo also featured advanced astronomical alignments, water management systems, and methods of communication. Some of these buildings stood 5 stories tall and lasted for centuries without collapsing, despite the fact that they were built without written blueprints. How did a civilization with no written language manage that? And like we asked earlier, where did all the workers come from? Constructing Pueblo Bonito, along with 14 other great houses, plus hundreds of smaller unit pueblos, is a huge job. Even over 300 years, a total population of 2,000, only a portion of whom would be able to work, just wouldn't be enough to pull off something this massive. They would have needed thousands of builders and a very organized leadership to manage operations, no written communication, no postal system, no phones. Yet somehow, a large workforce was coordinated over several generations to build what is now considered one of the architectural wonders of ancient North America. By all logic, that shouldn't have been possible. Then there's the issue of raw materials. Around 250,000 trees were used for the construction of Chaco Canyon, and only a small number came from nearby. The local trees weren't even strong enough to support these buildings. So the Chacoans had to go as far as 50 miles on foot to gather suitable wood from areas like the Chusca Mountains, Zuni Mountains, and Mount Taylor. What's unbelievable is that they carried all these logs back by foot, without wheels, carts, or animals to help. But it gets weirder. Despite all the massive buildings, there aren't many signs of everyday living like fire pits, kitchens, or sleeping areas. Instead, there's a huge number of kivas, underground rooms used for religious ceremonies. And when I say there are a lot of kivas, I mean a lot. Pueblo Bonito alone contains 40 of them. That's about 1 kiva for every 29 rooms, or roughly 1 for every 2 people. Again, we're left asking, why? And we're still not done with the oddities. Let's talk about the roads. How do we explain the network of roads in Chaco Canyon? We're talking about more than 800 miles of roads, many of them well-designed and clearly intentional. Some link the great houses together, while others just stop abruptly, without leading anywhere. What makes this more confusing is that the wheel wasn't even in use in this region. There's no evidence that the Chacoans had carts or any type of wheeled transport. So why go to the trouble of building roads just for walking? Even more puzzling are the measurements. The main roads are about 33 feet wide, and the secondary ones are around half that. But again, Chaco had no vehicles. So why were these walkways so wide if they were only meant for foot traffic? To add to it, the roads built by the Chacoans were extremely straight and never curved around any obstacle. If a road came across a cliff, they didn't stop. They constructed a stairway, and if it ran into a mountain, they simply built over it and continued the road. While these engineers didn't go around obstacles, there was one thing they consistently avoided: gentle curves. Chaco roads maintained straight lines and included sharp turns, even when they split off toward other destinations. What makes this so surprising, even to archaeologists, is that today, even with modern construction techniques and technology, projects like this are difficult to finish, and some of the most expensive projects, backed by billionaires, still end up being abandoned. So when you take a step back and compare all this, the real question becomes, how did a civilization with far fewer tools and resources than we have today manage to pull off a construction effort that lasted 300 years and followed the original design so precisely? And that's not all. Chaco Canyon also shows no indication of any kind of defense system, despite the fact that the people who lived there were extremely wealthy. And yes, the Chacoans did gather a lot of wealth. Take Pueblo Bonito, for example. It had an entire room dedicated just for red macaw parrots. If you know anything about these birds, you'd know they're very costly to buy and even harder to raise. That was true back then too. Maybe even more so, because red macaws were considered symbols of political power and high status. Archaeologists uncovered massive amounts of valuable items, hundreds of thousands of turquoise beads, shell and jet beads, copper bells, and even traces of chocolate. Clearly, they were rich, but their wealth doesn't fully explain it. They had something more than just money. They had no form of protection in place to guard their treasures. What's even more puzzling is that when they left Chaco Canyon, they didn't bother taking most of their valuables with them. Was their wealth so abundant that they could afford to leave all of that behind after collecting only what they valued most? Or was there something more troubling that forced them to leave in a hurry? Graham Hancock believes that Chaco Canyon wasn't just a normal ancient settlement. He thinks it was created by survivors of a highly advanced civilization that existed during the Ice Age and was later destroyed around 12,000 years ago. According to him, these survivors traveled the world and helped early cultures build impressive structures and understand astronomy. He says Chaco Canyon is one of those places, filled with hidden meanings and aligned with the stars in ways that suggest deep knowledge. Hancock also claims that when he and his team tried to film there for his documentary, they were stopped. He believes this might be because the truth about the site challenges accepted history. Some Native American groups were upset by his ideas, saying they disrespect indigenous beliefs by suggesting that outsiders built what their ancestors created. Still, Hancock stands by his theory and thinks something important is being kept quiet about Chaco Canyon. Before getting into the theories about what might have caused the Chacoans to vanish so suddenly, let's look at one more thing. The Chacoans also had a surprisingly advanced understanding of astronomy, long before telescopes existed. Experts have found that the positioning of the walls of major structures in Chaco Canyon was based on astronomical observations. Chetro Kettle and Pueblo Bonito, for example, were aligned to match the moon's rising and setting points. During the lunar standstill, which happens once every 18.6 years, the moon can be seen perfectly framed within the doorways of these buildings. On top of that, 12 great houses also line up with the solar cycles, solstices and equinoxes included. The scale and accuracy of these alignments are hard to explain. Astronomers think this kind of precision had to come from knowledge passed down across generations. But here's the catch. How did a group of people without a written language develop and preserve such complicated ideas that most people today still struggle to understand? And even harder to answer, why would they walk away from a city that looked and functioned like a capital, filled with impressive buildings and perfectly constructed roads? Why didn't they ever build something similar again? There are plenty of theories, but none that explain everything. When we talk about the Chacoans who built and lived in Chaco Canyon, we're really referring to the Anasazi, now more commonly called the ancestral Puebloans, by their descendants. Their story stretches from deeply interesting to extremely disturbing. There are even reports of cannibalism backed by physical evidence found at the site. Still, to this day, there's no agreement on which theory is actually true. But let's start from the beginning. If you look at the Hopi people, descendants of the ancestral Pueblo, you'll see they are a deeply spiritual group. Their mythology includes gods who came through an underground portal known as a Sipapu and taught them a variety of important skills like pottery, agriculture, archery, and masonry. At first, the ancestral Pueblo lived underground and made baskets, sticking to a more basic way of life. But by around 750 CE, they started building cities above ground, using stone and advanced masonry methods. Some sources say that this knowledge was given to them directly by the gods. And that might remind you of something, doesn't it? Yes, the Anunnaki and the Sumerians. For those who aren't familiar, the Sumerians were basically the ancient world's version of what Silicon Valley is today. Agriculture, architecture, and even writing, all these ideas came from them. And just like the Chacoans, The Sumerians didn't have access to many natural resources, but their legends say the gods taught them how to build and create anyway. Because of these similarities, some people think the gods the Chacons worshipped may have actually been the Anunnaki. This theory suggests that the Anunnaki moved to the Americas after Sumer fell. Of course, how much truth you see in that is up to you. We won't go too deep into that here, but it's interesting to point out that many Mesoamerican, South American, and even ancestral Puebloan myths share recurring ideas. You can even find connections in the Sumerian stories about the Anunnaki. A very obvious one is the legend of the Ant People, who the Hopi say saved them from disaster twice and gave them knowledge and skills. In Hopi language, Anu means ant, and Naki means friend. So, the word Anunnaki could be translated as ant friend, which has led some to suggest that maybe the ant people who helped the ancestors of the Puebloans were actually the Anunnaki. Again, that's up to interpretation. But for now, let's return to the main discussion. Everything we've gone over so far points to one idea: that the ancestral Puebloans may have learned how to build Chaco Canyon from their gods. Whether you believe in the ant people or the Anunnaki, that still doesn't explain why they chose such a dry, unforgiving area for their most important construction. Start by looking at how many kivas there are at Chaco. Then look at how strange it is that they picked such an unlikely location. Add to that the careful alignment of their buildings with astronomical events. And finally, consider the scale of labor involved. When you take all of that into account, the only explanation that seems to connect the dots is that the construction was done for religious reasons. Think about it. There's no practical reason why anyone would build massive, carefully planned structures in the middle of a desert that was hard to live in. But what if they weren't building it for everyday living? What if they believed that land was sacred? At the time, lands were often thought to be sacred if they were believed to be places where gods had landed. So what if that's why they built in Chaco Canyon? Maybe they believed their gods had descended there. In that case, they might have created this massive city to honor those gods. Sounds possible, doesn't it? So then what about the buildings themselves? This, too, could be explained from a spiritual or religious perspective. The Chacons are believed to have cut down far too many trees and used farming methods that couldn't be sustained. That led to soil erosion and damage to their farmlands, which eventually caused food shortages. And with food becoming scarce, the people were forced to leave. It really makes you stop and think, especially considering how today's environmental warnings feel eerily similar. But hold on. Some researchers argue we shouldn't be too quick to accept that theory. W.H. Wills, Brandon L. Drake, and Witherby B. Dorshow from the Department of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico have challenged this idea. In a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they wrote, "There is no direct evidence for human impact on local woodlands during the Bonito phase, the period of high construction from AD 850 to 1150. No indication that agriculture fields were destroyed by deforestation or any other process, and surprisingly, no conclusive information about the amount and sources of archaeological wood. Indeed, it's hard to believe a drought would have disrupted their way of life enough to make them leave. They had already been living there with barely any rain for more than 30 years. Second, the ancestral Puebloans were known to survive in even harsher conditions. In fact, the types of corn they grew are some of the most drought-resistant varieties out there. Some of those corn strains are still around today if you want to see for yourself. The point is, it would have taken more than just a drought to push them out. They had already adjusted completely to the environment. So, the drought theory doesn't hold up well. In fact, after a detailed study, the National Academy of Sciences had this to say: after extensive review, the archaeological and environmental record failed to produce evidence of an event that was severe enough to cause the people to abandon their settlements. So, If we go by what the experts concluded, we're back at the social collapse theory. Somehow, this deeply spiritual group of people went through a breakdown in their society, and they left, never to return. But the question remains, how exactly did that happen? Was it the result of a revolt against the ancestral Puebloan leaders who practiced cannibalism, or were they simply taken by the gods, as some believe? Finding out the full truth is difficult because many Native Americans prefer not to share the sacred details of their history with outsiders. Of course, that's entirely their right, but that also means there's a lot of room for speculation, and that's really all anyone can do for now. So, what do you think happened? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.